Hey everybody, and welcome back to Just a Mental Note. Today we got our DSM-5 back and we're going to be talking all about the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. If you haven't seen any of my other explaining mental illness videos, this is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's a giant book of mental disorders that professionals in the mental health field use to diagnose their patients. Now, this may seem pretty self-explanatory, but PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is in the trauma and stressor-related disorders area. This means that this disorder is caused by trauma. However, trauma is very, very different. It varies widely across everybody. What one person thinks of as a traumatic event may not be traumatic for somebody else. There are things that are probably traumatic for everybody. I know that when people think of PTSD, a lot of times people think of veterans, but that doesn't mean that going to war is the only way to get PTSD. People can get PTSD from all sorts of traumas. There's a whole range of things that can be considered traumatic for a person. And as long as this event is considered traumatic for that person, they may then develop PTSD. The first diagnostic criteria for PTSD is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. Number one, directly experiencing the traumatic events. That means that you are the person who has dealt with this traumatic event, which is the way that a lot of people think of PTSD. Something happened to me, something traumatic happened to me, and now I have PTSD. The second way that you can be exposed to these traumatic events is witnessing in person the events as it occurred to others. So you can be traumatized by something that didn't necessarily happen directly to you, but that you saw. Say you saw a horrible, terrible car accident. You can still be traumatized even if you weren't part of the accident yourself. The third way of exposure is learning that the traumatic events occurred to a close family member or close friend. In cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the events must have been violent or accidental. You witnessing somebody that you love go through a traumatic event is a traumatic event in itself for you. So people can experience PTSD by seeing their loved ones go through these traumatic experiences and seeing firsthand what happened. The fourth way that a person can be exposed to these types of traumatic events is experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic events. And they give some examples. First responders collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse. So this is when you are constantly being told about bad things that are happening to other people. This can happen in therapists because they are often just hearing the most horrible traumatic stories. You can experience PTSD if you are constantly being told all of these horrific traumatic events in detail. You can develop the PTSD yourself. So those are all the ways that a person can be exposed to a traumatic event, and that exposure could then lead to the PTSD symptoms. The second diagnostic criteria for PTSD is the presence of one or more of the following intrusion symptoms associated with the traumatic events beginning after the traumatic events occurred. So you have to have at least one of these following symptoms that I'm going to go over. The first intrusion symptom a person could experience is recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive, distressing memories of the traumatic events. This is when you just can't get that out of your mind. It plays over and over and over and over and over again. The second intrusion symptom a person can experience is recurrent distressing dreams in which the content and/or affect of the dream are related to the traumatic events. These are nightmares, and this is a very commonly known thing that comes with PTSD. It's like your brain is not only constantly replaying it while you're awake, but while you're asleep, you almost have to relive it as well. The third intrusive symptoms that people with PTSD can experience is dissociative reactions, for example, flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic events were occurring. Such reactions may occur on a continuum, with the most extreme expression being a complete loss of awareness of present surroundings. So this is like that real big cornerstone of PTSD that a lot of people think of. It's that flashbacks. It could be as extreme as I'm feeling this, it's real, it's happening again. I am experiencing this traumatic event again. The next symptom is intense or prolonged psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic events. It's when a person sees something or experiences something, there's some sort of cue in their environment that reminds them of their trauma, and they have the psychological symptoms that come along with that. The last intrusion symptom that they point out that people with PTSD could experience is marked physiological reactions to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic events. These are like physical triggers. If you hear a loud noise and you physically hide, you physically flinch, you have that physical reaction. The symptom before this is talking about your psychological reactions to triggers, to cues in your environment that remind you of your trauma. So you have your psychological reactions, but you also have your physiological reactions. Both of those are triggers, they're different type of triggers. You can have things that trigger like an emotional response, or you can have things that trigger a physiological response. A lot of times those go together because your mind and your body are so connected, but not always. The third diagnostic criteria for PTSD is persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic events, beginning after the traumatic events occurred, as evidenced by one or both of the following. So this means that a person is avoiding things that remind them of their trauma. Now, there are two different ways that this can happen. The first one is avoidance of or efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic events. This is like an internal avoidance. You don't want to think about it, you don't want to remember it. You really just do whatever you can in your brain so that way your brain is not thinking about it. It's avoiding it at all costs. The second one is avoidance of or efforts to avoid external reminders, people's, places, conversations, activities, objects, situations that arouse distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic events. So the first one is talking about avoiding your own thoughts, your own memories. The second one is talking about avoiding those external triggers. You avoid people, places, conversations, all of these sorts of things, these external things that are going to remind you of the trauma. The fourth diagnostic criteria for PTSD is negative alterations in cognitions and mood associated with the traumatic events, beginning or worsening after the traumatic events occurred, as evidenced by two or more of the following. So for all of the criteria before this, you only needed one of those symptoms. For this criteria, you need at least two of these symptoms. And this is negative changes in your thoughts and mood associated with the trauma. The first example of this is inability to remember an important aspect of the traumatic events, typically due to dissociative amnesia and not due to other factors such as head injury, alcohol, or drugs. So this is when a person can't remember part of a traumatic event, not because they were on a substance, not because they had an actual brain injury or anything like that, but simply because their brain has decided it's too traumatic for them to remember. The second negative change in cognition or mood is persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself, others, or the world. For example, I am bad, no one can be trusted, the world is completely dangerous, my whole nervous system is permanently ruined. This is a symptom that just causes you to think extremely negatively, but in an all or nothing kind of way. It's either I'm good or I'm bad, and with this disorder, I'm bad. The world is bad, the world is scary. The third negative change in cognition or mood that a person with PTSD could experience is persistent, distorted cognitions about the cause or consequences of the traumatic event that leads the individual to blame himself or others. So this is when a person experiences a traumatic event and then, like it says, blame themselves or somebody else that has nothing to do with it. For example, if a person is attacked, they may blame themselves for that attack. Oh, I shouldn't have been walking alone at night. I shouldn't have trusted this person. It's you start to blame yourself or you blame the other people around you. The next negative change in cognition or mood is persistent negative emotional state. You just always have these negative emotions. They have examples on here: fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame. And that's really the emotional sphere you live in. You don't have those happy emotions. You are very angry, you're very sad, you're scared. That's kind of the emotional state that you're in all the time. You have this persistent negative mood. The next symptom is markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. It's almost like the person's mind is so wrapped up in the trauma and what happened to them that they can't enjoy their lives anymore. They're too busy trying to avoid things that remind them of their trauma to avoid life. They're too busy thinking all these negative thoughts to enjoy life. You don't want to go out and do things. You don't want to go and do all of the activities or hobbies you were interested in before because, you're more worried about protecting yourself, protecting your mind. The next symptom is feelings of detachment or estrangement from others. And this is really, you don't feel attached to the people around you. You feel disconnected, you feel estranged, you feel like there's something in between you two that can't cause you to connect. And that is a very common response to trauma. A lot of times when people are traumatized or they go through a traumatic event, their brain kind of shuts off their emotions, pushes things away, because it's easier to deal with things that are arm's length than it is to deal with something that's super close. The last change in cognition or mood that the book mentions is persistent inability to experience positive emotions. For example, inability to experience happiness, satisfaction, or loving feelings. Like I said before, a person with PTSD has a lot of negative emotions that they're dealing with, and they're dealing with this sadness, this anger, this guilt, this fear, shame, whatever those negative emotions are. There's no room for the positive emotions. With the average person, you have a whole variety of moods that you can have. You can be happy, you can be sad, you can be angry, you can be joyous, a whole bunch of things. But with PTSD, the person really lives in those negative emotions and almost has an inability to feel those positive ones. The fifth diagnostic criteria is not the last one, but it's the last one with a whole group of symptoms with it. So, the fifth diagnostic criteria for PTSD is marked alterations in arousal or reactivity associated with the traumatic events, beginning or worsening after the traumatic events occurred, as evidenced by 2 or more of the following. So again, for this one, you need to have 2 of these symptoms in order to be possibly diagnosed with PTSD. The first symptom that they mention of marked alterations in arousal and reactivity is irritable behavior and angry outbursts with little or no provocation, typically expressed as verbal or physical aggression towards people or objects. People dealing with PTSD, they have a lot of emotions inside. They have a lot of things that they are dealing with, and sometimes that can give them a very short fuse. People with PTSD are known for outbursts, for anger outbursts, where they yell, they may throw things, they may hit a wall, slam doors, whatever it is. But it's because they have all of these negative emotions and they don't know how to deal with them. And so the way their brain decides to deal with it, at least at that point, is by having an anger outburst. The next symptom is recklessness or self-destructive behavior. Sometimes after a person experiences a traumatic event, they go super protective, super into themselves. They're very scared. There are also other people that say, screw it, this terrible thing happened to me, now I'm gonna go and do whatever I want. I'm gonna go and do reckless things. I'm gonna go and be self-destructive. I'm gonna go and do whatever I want because this terrible, horrible thing happened to me, so what does it matter what happens to me now? The next symptom is hypervigilance, and this is a person who always knows what's going on around them at all times. They pay attention to every little detail, every little sound, every little movement, because, they're trying to protect themselves. It's their brain's way of trying to protect themselves from something bad happening. The next symptom is very common with PTSD, but it's also like a cornerstone symptom. This is a symptom that a lot of people think of when they think of PTSD, and that's the exaggerated startle response. So a person with PTSD gets startled very easily. You may touch them on the shoulder and they're like, "Whoa, why did you do that?" Obviously that was a little extreme and probably shouldn't have done that. My hips aren't great. But it's just that a person with PTSD is startled very easily, and you can physically see it in their startle response. The next symptom is problems with concentration. And that makes sense to me, because if you're paying attention to literally everything around you all of the time, how can you concentrate on what you're trying to do? If you're trying to pay attention to literally every noise, every person, everything that is around you, how could you concentrate on a task? And the last one is sleep disturbance. For example, difficulty falling or staying asleep or restless sleep. So this is just a person who, after their traumatic events, can't sleep. And now it may be due to the nightmares, or it may just be due to the physical reaction to the trauma. And I mean, when you have that type of trauma, when you are dealing with flashbacks of this trauma, you have a lot of hormones and adrenaline and those types of things in your body that can really, really mess with your sleep. So those are all the diagnostic criteria that have their own symptoms to go along with it. Again, the first one, exposure to the traumatic event. The second one, the presence of those intrusion symptoms. And the third diagnostic criteria, the persistent avoidance of stimuli. You only need one of each of those symptoms to qualify for PTSD, whereas those last two groups, the negative alterations in cognitions and mood, and the marked alterations in arousal and reactivity, you need to have at least two of those symptoms to qualify. The DSM then goes on to explain a few more diagnostic criteria that are really put in place to make sure that what the person experiencing is PTSD. It's not another disorder, it's not something else going on, it is PTSD. So the sixth diagnostic criteria for PTSD is that the duration of the disturbance is more than 1 month. You have to have these symptoms, these experiences, for at least 1 month following your traumatic experience. And that's because a lot of these reactions are normal reactions to trauma. It is very normal for a person who has just been through a traumatic experience to be startled easily, to be anxious, to have these negative emotions, to have this hypervigilance. All of that's normal reactions. But if these types of situations, symptoms, experiences go longer than 1 month after the traumatic event, then it can be considered PTSD and not just a normal reaction to trauma. The seventh diagnostic criteria is the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. This is a criteria that is in most, if not all, of the disorders in here. And it's just saying that this disorder has to cause you clinically significant distress. This disorder has to impact your life in some way in order to be diagnosed. You can't be diagnosed with a disorder if that disorder isn't actually impacting your life in any way. And the last diagnostic criteria is that the disturbance is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance or another medical condition. So this means that the symptoms you're experiencing are due to PTSD. They're not because you took a medication. You are not experiencing these because of a substance. You're not experiencing these because of another medical condition. You are having these symptoms because you were exposed to a traumatic event and then developed PTSD afterwards. It's not because of something else going on with your body. And that is all of the diagnostic criteria, at least for people over 6 for PTSD. The book then does go on to explain all of the criteria for children under 6. So if you want me to do a video on that, I can do that as well, just let me know. But I know that the vast majority of people watching this, I mean, there should be nobody under 6 watching my videos. I don't know why anybody under 6 would be watching these. So I really thought that it was more important to focus on the adult symptoms as opposed to the small child symptoms. Thank you guys so much for watching this entire video. You have no idea, again, I say this every time, but you really have no idea how much all of your love and support and everything means to me. This is the part where I tell you, if you haven't already, to please smash that like button for me, click the subscribe button, and ring the notification bell so that way you will always be notified when a new video is up. If you have any questions, comments, you want any clarifications on anything I've said today, or if you have an idea for videos I should do in the future, please make sure to just leave them down in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time.